So I think we can move straight on to Adelina's presentation on global estimation of HCV incidence.
Hi everyone. Unfortunately, I was not able to attend INSHU in person this year, but I am very pleased to be able to attend virtually and in particular to contribute to this session that is focused on monitoring progress towards the viral hepatitis elimination targets. And before I begin, I wanted to highlight that a lot of people have contributed to the work that I will be showing you today. That includes colleagues and mentors from the University of Bristol, in particular Peter Vickerman, Matthew Hickman, and Jack Stone, as well as colleagues from the WHO, NDARC, and the University of New South Wales in Australia. Okay, so I won't be spending too much time on this slide because Sema will have already introduced the viral hepatitis elimination framework and the targets for elimination. The point that I wanted to make here is that we now have a target for people who specific to people who inject drugs. It's an incident target to be achieved by 2030. And that is really important because it really recognizes the need to focus our elimination efforts on this population in particular. But at the same time, that also means that we need to be able to measure incidence and track it closely on a global scale. So we did a series of papers in which the focus was to try and improve the data that we have on the incidence of HCV among people who inject drugs. So the first project was a global systematic review of directly measured incidence. And so in this review, we've only included estimates, direct measures of incidence, and that means we've excluded any modeled estimates. But other than that, we've adopted quite a broad search criteria. We've included studies that were published as early as the 1990s. And even so, even with this broad inclusion criteria, we found the evidence base to be quite limited. We've only identified 66 estimates of HCV incidence in people who inject drugs. These were coming from 24 countries only, and the vast majority of countries were high-income countries. So this review clearly highlighted an important gap in the evidence base for HCV incidence in people who inject drugs. So this led us into our next piece of work in which we leveraged prevalence data to indirectly estimate incidence. And for that, we used force of infection models. And these types of models, which are relatively simple, have been used in the past for other infectious diseases to estimate incidence from prevalence data and duration of risk. In our case, duration of risk was defined as the duration of injecting. And the basic premise is that the probability of infection accumulates over time. And by looking at how the prevalence of HCV antibody prevalence increases with the duration of injection, we can get an indirect estimate of incidence. So we've applied this method to as many countries as possible, as many countries that had data on prevalence stratified by duration of injecting. And so now we started to have more estimates of incidence. We had the direct estimates from the review that I mentioned earlier. We now had 72 estimates because we've updated the review. We had an additional 79 estimates that were indirect based on this force of infection method. But still, that left us with a lot of countries that did not have any estimate of incidence. So we brought in another set of estimates. These were published estimates that were derived from a dynamic mathematical model. This is work that was led by Adam Trickey a few years ago. This is a multi-country dynamic mathematical model in which the goal was to look at the contribution of injection drug use to global transmission. But one of the outcomes of that model was country-specific incidence in people who inject drugs for 2019. And so we've used 68 of those estimates as well. And then lastly, there were still a number of countries for which we did not have any estimate of incidence. And for these countries, we used a more crude approach whereby we predicted incidence based on prevalence and duration of injecting. So now we had a total of 188 indirect estimates of incidence, which we could combine with the 72 direct estimates. So this slide is showing all of the estimates that we had for the pre-2015 period. So we had data for a total of 81 countries. And a couple of things that you'll notice on the slide are that, first of all, most countries only have one estimate of incidence, but there are a few exceptions like the UK, the US, and China, which have 10 or more estimates. Second, even though not all countries have a direct estimate of incidence, many countries do. These are shown in red. Some regions have more estimates than others, like the European region. You can see most countries have an estimate of incidence. However, in some regions, like the African region, there are very few countries with data, and there is no direct estimate. All of the available estimates are based on are indirect, based on prevalence. This slide is showing the estimates that we have for the post-2015 period. We refer to this as the 2015 and 2021 period because most recent estimate that we had was for 2021. So we had data for a total of 97 countries, and aside for a few exceptions like Canada and the US, which had direct estimates, most countries did not have a direct estimate for this time period. Most of the estimates were indirect based on the dynamic mathematical model that I mentioned earlier. So this slide is showing the country-specific incidence in the world maps at the top, and then the region and global estimates in the table. So overall, for the pre-2015 period, we've estimated the incidence of HCV to be 13.9 per 100 person years. And for the 2015-2021 period, this was lower, estimated at 8.6 per 100 person years. Now, there is a lot of variability between countries and between regions, which is not surprising, but we did find that the incidence was lowest in the African region. And another thing that is apparent from the slide is that even with the use of these different methods to estimate incidence, there were still some parts of the world that have considerable gaps in data, and that includes in particular the African region. Very few countries. We were able to get incidence data for a relatively small number of countries. We were also interested in exploring whether there has been any change in incidence pre and post 2015. And so this is what this slide is showing. It's the rate ratio comparing the more recent period relative to the earlier period. And on average, we found that for the Eastern Mediterranean, the European, and the Western Pacific regions, incidence was lower in the more recent time period. However, we were not able to find any difference, a difference in over time for the American region, and that is due in large part to the fact that the incidence did not change much for the US, and the US has one of the largest population sizes, has the largest population size, I should say, globally, and that has a big weight on the regional estimate. And we were not able to look at trends over time for the other regions just because there were very few countries with data across both time periods. And lastly, we were also interested in knowing what is the annual number of HCV infections that are attributed to injection drug use. Now that we had country-specific incidence data in people who inject drugs, we brought in data on the population size for people who inject drugs and the prevalence to get estimates of the number of people at risk. And so with these data, we estimated that globally, slightly more than 830,000 new infections occur annually attributable due to injection drug use. So this is a very large figure, but as you can see, there is also a lot of uncertainty around it, and that is due in large part to the uncertainty that we see with the population size estimates for people who inject drugs. Okay, so a couple of points that I want to highlight in conclusion. First, I think this work is important because it produced the first global map of HCV incidence in people who inject drugs. So by combining different methods and prevalence data, we were able to expand the number of countries that have estimates of incidence in this population from 25, if we were to include only the direct estimates, to 105. I think one of the key findings of this work is that incidence remains far above the elimination target set by WHO for people who inject drugs. So based on the global estimate for the more recent time period, we estimate that a decline of 77% is needed globally to achieve the target of 2 per 100 person years. We've also found that incidence varies substantially between countries and regions, and that the progress towards the elimination targets is uneven. And I've highlighted here a few outliers, but overall we found incidence to vary quite a bit from country to country. And I think one of the key implications of this is that there really is a need to scale up interventions for people who inject drugs. And I think the finding that the incidence is very high aligns with two reviews that were done recently, which highlighted that the coverage of prevention interventions and the coverage of testing and treatment interventions in people who inject drugs is largely suboptimal. And finally, this work also highlights a need to have dedicated efforts for monitoring HCV incidence, particularly in areas that are for which we have little data, or in areas where there is evidence of high levels of transmission. And I think the African region is an area where we need more data because there are just very few estimates, and there is no direct estimates of HCV incidence. And even though prospective cohort studies are typically considered the gold standard for estimating incidence and are ideal, they may not be realistic in many settings. And the point that I wanted to make here is that there may be other ways of estimating incidence in these settings. For example, by leveraging programmatic data from harm reduction services, where people who inject drugs receive routine testing for hepatitis C. So we have been able to do a similar type of work to estimate HIV incidence in countries like Myanmar and South Africa. And finally, I'm going to end on this slide to say that even with these different ways of estimating incidence, it's still possible that some countries will not be able to get an estimate of incidence going forward. And it may be in these settings, it may be possible to use trends in chronic prevalence as an alternative indicator, because based on modeling work that was led by the team, by Peter Vickerman's team at University of Bristol, we found that there is a strong correlation in trends in incidence and trends in chronic prevalence over time, suggesting that trends in chronic prevalence could serve as a more easy to measure alternative indicator to monitor the elimination targets. And with that, thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed the rest of the conference.